Before Adam, before the Bible's first man supposedly walked the earth, ancient Mesopotamian tablets describe 7 beings who came out of the sea to teach humanity everything it knew. Not gods, not angels, something else entirely, something the priests of Babylon called Apkallu. These weren't myths dreamed up to explain thunder or harvests. These were structured, detailed accounts, written in cuneiform, copied and recopied for over 2,000 years by scribes who treated them as historical fact. 7 sages, half human, half fish, or wrapped in fish cloaks depending on the source, rising from the waters of the Persian Gulf to hand humans the tools of civilization. Writing, agriculture, law, architecture, medicine, the very foundations of everything we call society today. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Some of these tablets were deliberately suppressed, locked away, considered too dangerous, too secret, too destabilizing for common eyes. Only the highest priests were allowed to read them. Why would a list of teachers be classified information in the ancient world? If you're settling in to fall asleep to this, that's exactly what it's here for. So subscribe if you haven't, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing London at midnight, Sydney at sunrise, Toronto right before bed, all at the same time, all listening to the same forgotten history. Over the next several sections, we're going to meet each of these 7 Apkallu, one by one, who they were, what they supposedly taught, and why their stories were considered so sacred that some tablets were literally banned from public reading. We'll separate what the clay tablets actually say from what later interpreters added, because this history deserves to be told carefully. And if ancient mysteries like this fascinate you, I've written a full book covering 12 of history's most unexplained puzzles. You'll find it on the website, link in the description below. If this show helps you unwind, the best way to support it is by following on Spotify, listening there, and leaving a 5-star review. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to where it all began, to the very first sage to rise from the sea. His name was Uanna, and if you want to understand why ancient Mesopotamians took him so seriously, you need to forget everything you think you know about how history gets recorded. We're not talking about a folktale passed down by campfire. We're talking about a name that shows up in king lists, ritual texts and scholarly commentaries across 2 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization, a name so foundational that later Greek writers, trying to explain Babylonian religion to a Mediterranean audience, gave him a new identity that would echo through Western scholarship for over 2,000 years. That name was Oannes. Around 280 BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berossus sat down to write a history of his homeland for his Greek overlords. Alexander's conquests had reshaped the ancient world, and Babylon now found itself under Hellenistic rule, part of the Seleucid Empire. Berossus wasn't some outsider looking in. He was a priest of the god Marduk, someone with direct access to the temple archives, someone trained in the traditional Babylonian sciences of astronomy, astrology, and historical record-keeping. When he wrote his account, he wasn't inventing folklore for entertainment. He was translating his civilization's sacred history into Greek for people who had never heard of Sumer, never heard of the Apkallu, never understood why Mesopotamians believed their entire civilization had been a gift from beings who emerged from the sea. Berossus called his work the Babyloniacca, and in it he described Oannes in language that should make your skin prickle a little, even now, thousands of years later. According to Berossus, Oannes appeared during the very first year after creation, emerging from the waters of the Persian Gulf, that stretch of sea the Greeks called the Erythraean Sea. He didn't come alone in the sense of being unique forever. Berossus tells us other similar beings would follow. But Oannes was first. He was the one who started it all. Here's where the account gets genuinely strange, and where you start to understand why this story stuck in people's minds for so long. Berosus describes Uanna as having the complete body of a fish, but underneath the fish's head, he had another head, a human one. Beneath the fish's tail, human feet emerged, and he spoke with a human voice. This wasn't a mermaid. This wasn't a simple fish deity like you might imagine from other ancient Near Eastern religions. This was something composite, something that seemed to exist in two states simultaneously, aquatic and human, divine and approachable. Later Greek and Roman writers who encountered Berosus's account or accounts derived from it tried to make sense of this imagery in their own terms. Some described Uanna as wearing what amounted to a fish costume, a large fish skin fitted over a human body, with the fish head sitting above the human head like a kind of hood, and the fish tail extending below the human feet like a robe. Whether this reflects the original Babylonian conception or a later attempt to rationalize a stranger, more alien image, we honestly can't be certain. The cuneiform sources that predate Berosus by centuries describe the Apkallu in ways that sometimes align with this fish-garbed human image and sometimes suggest something else entirely, something harder to pin down. What matters for understanding Berosus's account specifically is what happened next in his narrative. Uanna didn't just appear and vanish. According to Berosus, he spent his days among human beings, but here's the detail that separates this from typical ancient mythology. He never ate anything. He performed no biological functions that Berosus considered worth mentioning, no eating, no obvious sustenance. Instead, he spent his entire time with humanity teaching. Berosus is explicit that Uanna gave men the knowledge of letters, meaning writing itself, along with sciences and every kind of art. This is a staggering claim if you sit with it. Not fire. Not a single tool. The entire package of civilized knowledge, delivered by a fish-human hybrid who emerged from the sea and asked for nothing in return. Then, as the sun set each day, Uanna would return to the sea and spend the night in the depths of the Persian Gulf. Every single day this cycle repeated. Emerge at dawn, teach until dusk, submerge into the water until morning. Berosus tells us this continued for a considerable stretch of time, and that Uanna composed a written work on the origins of civilization and government, which he then handed over to humanity as a permanent record of what he had taught them. Now, why does any of this matter beyond being a colourful ancient story? Because Berosus wasn't writing in isolation. He was drawing on temple records, on the accumulated scholarly tradition of Babylon, on texts that had been copied and studied for centuries before he ever picked up a stylus, or in this case wrote in Greek for a Hellenistic audience. When modern scholars later gained access to actual cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, tablets Berosus himself would have studied, they found something remarkable. The name Uanna, sometimes rendered Uanna, or similar variants, depending on the tablet, and the period, appears in Mesopotamian texts describing exactly this kind of first sage figure. The Greek name Uanna wasn't some fabrication. It was a Hellenized version of a name the Sumerians and Babylonians had been using for this figure for well over 2,000 years before Berosus ever wrote a word. This is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how we should approach this whole subject. Berosus gives us the most complete narrative account we have of the first Apkallu, but he's writing centuries, arguably millennia, after the original Sumerian sources first recorded Uanna's name and role. He's a bridge figure, someone standing at the intersection of two civilizations, translating an ancient Mesopotamian tradition into terms a Greek-speaking audience could understand. That means we have to treat his account carefully. Some details might reflect authentic ancient tradition passed down faithfully. Others might reflect Berosus's own interpretation, or even later scribal elaborations that crept into the tradition over the centuries between the original Sumerian sources and his own writing. What we can say with confidence is this. The core elements of Berosus's account, a sage emerging from the sea, teaching writing and the arts of civilization, then returning to the water, align remarkably well with what we find in the older cuneiform sources. The name matches, the general role matches, the connection to the sea and to primordial time matches. This isn't a case of a Greek historian inventing something wholesale. This is a case of an ancient tradition, rooted in genuine Mesopotamian religious and historical thought, surviving long enough to be recorded by one of the last generations of scholars who had direct access to the original temple archives before much of that knowledge was lost or scattered. And that raises the question we'll need to sit with as we go deeper into who Uanna actually was, according to the older Sumerian and Akkadian sources themselves, the tablets that predate Berosus by centuries. Because before there was Oannes, the Greek retelling, there was Uanna, the figure the Sumerians themselves believed had walked, or rather swum, into their world at the very dawn of civilized time. The older tablets place Uanna in a world that existed before the great dividing line of Mesopotamian history, before the flood, before the kings we recognize from archaeology, before cities became ruins, dynasties became dust, and human memory had to begin again from whatever fragments survived. To the Mesopotamians, this wasn't just ancient history. It was antediluvian history, a different age, an age so remote that it stood on the other side of a catastrophe meant to have wiped away the first order of the world. And Uanna stood at its beginning. One of the most important sources is a text modern scholars call the Uruk list of kings and sages. It survives in late copies, but it preserves traditions that are much older. The tablet does something fascinating. It pairs the rulers of the earliest cities with the Apkallu sages who served during their reigns. 7 primordial kings, 7 primordial sages, a sequence that starts before the flood and continues in altered form after it. The first king named is Allulim, ruler of Eridu, and beside Allulim stands Uanna. That association matters because Eridu wasn't just any city. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first city, not necessarily the first settlement in the literal archaeological sense, although it was genuinely one of southern Mesopotamia's oldest urban centres. We're talking about something more important than that. Eridu was imagined as the first place where ordered human life took root. The place where the boundary between wilderness and civilization was first established. The first city before all other cities. Think about what that means. Before Uruk built its monumental temples, before Akkad rose under Sargon, before Babylon became the name everyone remembered, before even the legendary kings of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mesopotamian tradition placed Eridu at the beginning, and beside its first king it placed Uanna, not as a king, not as a god, something stranger, a sage. This is where modern assumptions can get in the way. When we hear the word sage, we might picture an old philosopher sitting alone, writing down wisdom. But the Apkallu were not simply wise men. They were figures attached to the deepest structures of cosmic order. They belonged to the god Ea, called Enki in Sumerian, the great lord of the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, the god of hidden depths, ritual power, cunning intelligence, creation, and dangerous knowledge. Eridu was Ea's city, so when Uanna appears at Eridu during the reign of the first king, the story isn't random. It creates a chain, the freshwater abyss, Ea, Eridu, the first king, the first Apkallu. Everything begins at the edge of the waters, and in Mesopotamia, water was never just water. The rivers gave life, but they also flooded without warning. The marshes fed communities but concealed danger. The sea connected the known world to vast regions beyond the horizon, places where merchants travelled and ordinary people did not. Beneath all of it lay the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater deep believed to nourish springs, canals, wetlands, and life itself. Uanna belonged to that liminal space, not fully part of the human world, but entering it. Not one of the gods who ruled from far above, but an intermediary. A being who crossed a boundary that humans normally could not cross. That's why calling him the first teacher has a deeper meaning than it seems at first. He wasn't simply the first person to instruct humanity. He was the first figure in the tradition to bring authority from outside ordinary human experience into the human realm. In later Mesopotamian thought, the pre-flood sages represented a time when divine and human worlds had not yet been fully separated. After the flood, that separation becomes sharper. The old tablets preserve this distinction in a remarkably deliberate way. Before the flood, the Apkallu are described as extraordinary beings, sages of primordial origin. After the flood, the tradition speaks instead of human scholars, priests, and exorcists who trace their authority back to those earlier figures. The later experts can inherit the tradition. They can copy the rituals, preserve the texts, invoke the names. But they are not quite the same. It's like the difference between standing beside the original source of a river and drinking from it thousands of miles downstream. The water is connected, the lineage is real, but something has changed along the way. That change is central to how Mesopotamian scribes understood their own role. A temple scholar was not just a person with a library. He was part of a chain reaching back beyond the flood. When he recited an incantation, interpreted a celestial omen, or carried out a purification rite, he could understand himself as working within a tradition first established in that impossible first age. And Uanna was at the head of that chain now. We need to be careful here. None of this proves that a literal non-human teacher arrived in prehistoric Mesopotamia. The king lists give reign lengths that stretch into tens of thousands of years, numbers modern historians do not read as normal political chronology. These texts are not neutral records in the modern sense. They are sacred history, cosmic history, an attempt to explain why civilization possessed order at all. But sacred history is still history in another sense. It tells us what a civilization believed mattered. What it believed had to come first. And the Mesopotamians did not put conquest first. They did not put wealth first. They did not even put kingship first. They placed a sage beside the first king. Before government could endure, before cities could claim legitimacy, before later generations could call themselves civilized, there had to be an original connection to the deep. A first mediator, a figure who stood at the threshold between the realm of Ea and the realm of humanity. But the tablets give Uanna one description that makes his position even more intriguing. They say he was the sage who completed the plans of heaven and earth. What does that actually mean? At first glance, it sounds like a creation myth. As if Uanna helped design the universe itself, placing the stars, measuring the rivers, deciding where mountains would rise. But Mesopotamian religious language often works on two levels at once. Heaven and earth were cosmic realities, yes, but they were also systems of order. The plans of heaven and earth meant the correct arrangement of things. The rules that made a temple, a city, a king legitimate, a ritual effective, a field productive, and a boundary secure. Uanna did not merely bring information. He completed the blueprint. Think about civilization as a machine with thousands of moving parts. You need food production. You need irrigation. You need builders who understand mud brick and drainage. You need calendars to know when rivers will rise and when crops should be planted. You need laws, weights, measures, records, specialists, religious ceremonies, and people trusted to perform them. Take away any one piece, and the whole thing becomes unstable. The Mesopotamians looked at this overwhelming complexity and asked a question we still ask today. Where did all of that knowledge come from? Their answer was not that it appeared slowly, by accident, through thousands of ordinary discoveries made by unnamed people. Their answer was Uanna, not necessarily Uanna alone in every surviving text. The 7 Apkallu as a group became associated with the deep foundations of knowledge. But Uanna, as the first, stood at the opening of the chain. He was the beginning point, the moment when knowledge crossed from the divine realm into human society, and this is where the story becomes more interesting than the simple phrase, "A fish man taught people civilization." That later image is famous. But the Mesopotamian tradition behind it is more sophisticated. Civilization was not imagined as a pile of inventions. It was a sacred order. Knowledge only worked if it was transmitted correctly, preserved faithfully, and used in the proper place at the proper time. A canal built badly could destroy a harvest. A ritual spoken incorrectly could fail when protection was needed most. A king without divine legitimacy was not simply unpopular. He was dangerous. His failure could threaten the balance between the human world and the gods. So the knowledge attributed to Uanna was knowledge of order. The order of water. The order of fields. The order of temples. The order of ritual. The order of authority. And that makes perfect sense in southern Mesopotamia. This was a landscape where civilization had to be engineered every day. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates could be incredibly fertile, but only if communities controlled water with canals, dikes, basins, sluices, and coordinated labour. Too little water and crops died, too much water and settlements vanished beneath floodwater. Leave canals unattended, and silt slowly turned prosperity back into marsh. In a place like that, practical knowledge was never merely practical. It was survival. You can imagine the experience of an early farming community. A river changes course, a canal bank collapses, salt gathers in the soil after years of irrigation. The harvest shrinks. Families begin to go hungry. Suddenly the person who understands water management is not just a worker. He holds the difference between order and catastrophe. Now multiply that across an entire city. This is why Mesopotamian scribes could treat technical knowledge, ritual knowledge, and divine knowledge as parts of the same system. To us, astronomy, medicine, architecture, agriculture, and religious ceremony belong in separate categories. To them, all were expressions of hidden patterns embedded in the world. The stars followed their paths, rivers followed their courses, disease showed signs, sacrifices required correct words. Bricks had proper dimensions, kingship had proper succession. Nothing important was random. The Apkallu were guardians of that pattern. Later, Mesopotamian scholars claimed that their learned traditions came from the ancient sages. Exorcists, diviners, ritual specialists, and scribes preserved texts that were often presented as immensely old, sometimes as revelations rooted in the age before the flood. This does not mean every tablet was literally written in some lost antediluvian civilization. Most surviving manuscripts are far later, but it does show how seriously these experts took the idea of inherited knowledge. They did not see themselves as inventors, they saw themselves as custodians. And that may be the most important thing Uanna represents. Not a single miraculous lesson, but the principle that civilization depends on memory. A society can discover powerful things, but if it cannot preserve them, teach them, copy them, and pass them on through disaster, those discoveries disappear. A generation learns how to manage a canal. The next generation neglects the records. A temple burns, a city falls, the people scatter. Within a few centuries, knowledge that once seemed permanent can become legend. If you enjoy these questions about ancient knowledge, lost history, and the mysteries that still resist easy explanations, there's a book on our website about 12 unexplained mysteries. The link is in the description. The Mesopotamians understood this danger better than almost anyone. Their cities rose and fell constantly. Floods destroyed neighborhoods. Wars shattered dynasties, libraries were buried, languages changed, and yet scribes kept copying old texts, preserving names from eras so distant that even they could barely imagine them. Uanna became the ultimate symbol of that continuity. His wisdom was not just old, it was older than the world as humans knew it, older than the flood, older than the division between ordinary people and the divine source of knowledge. To invoke him was to say that the ritual, the text, or the craft being performed did not begin with us. It belonged to an original order. There is something almost haunting about that, because every civilization tells itself a story about where knowledge comes from. Some say it comes from heroic inventors, some say it comes from ancestors. Some say it is discovered through reason. Mesopotamia said that the first and deepest knowledge came from the waters below the earth, carried into the first city by a being who stood between gods and humans. Not because the people of Mesopotamia were incapable of innovation. They were among history's greatest innovators. They built cities, developed writing, organized long-distance trade, and created legal, mathematical, and astronomical traditions that influenced the world for millennia. But they knew innovation alone was not enough. Knowledge needed a foundation. It needed a lineage, it needed someone at the beginning. And in the oldest chain of sages, that someone was Uanna. But Uanna was only the first. After him came another figure, another name preserved across thousands of years of broken tablets and reconstructed traditions. Enmedugga, the second sage, would carry the sequence forward. Number 2, Uannedugga, the second sage. The name sounds strange to us because it has crossed an enormous distance, not just from another language, but from another way of preserving memory. Before alphabetic writing, before paper, before books in anything like the modern sense. Enmedugga comes to us through signs pressed into wet clay, copied by scribes, broken by time, buried under ruined cities, and pieced back together by scholars thousands of years later. And in one of the most important sources for the Apkallu tradition, the Uruk sages list. His name is there. Enmedugga, a single name in a sequence, but not a casual name. Not the name of a random priest, king, or local hero. He appears among the primeval sages, the beings associated with the age before the flood, before the world of ordinary human history had fully begun. That is what makes this list so fascinating. The tablet comes from Uruk, one of the greatest cities of ancient Mesopotamia. A city so old that even later Mesopotamians looked back at its earliest foundations with something close to awe. Uruk was associated with kingship, temples, writing, and the deep past. It was the city of Gilgamesh, the city whose ruins still rise from the Iraqi plain, layer upon layer of human occupation built across millennia. And somewhere within the scholarly culture of that ancient city, scribes preserved a list connecting rulers and sages from the remotest imaginable past. The Uruk sages list is not a story in the usual sense. It does not stop to describe scenes, conversations, battles, or miracles. It is more like an archive of authority, names arranged with the confidence of people who believed they were recording a real chain of transmission. That matters because ancient lists can look boring at first. A modern reader sees a series of names and thinks, where is the plot? But to Mesopotamian scribes, A list could contain an entire worldview. A king list told you who had ruled and where legitimate power came from. A god list mapped relationships between divine forces. A lexical list organized the world itself, giving names to animals, tools, cities, stones, professions, and rituals. And a list of sages did something even more unusual. It traced knowledge back to its source. Think about what a name in that list is really doing. It is not simply identifying an individual, it is staking a claim. This ritual knowledge has ancestors. This scholarly tradition did not arise yesterday. This wisdom was passed down through a line older than dynasties, older than temples, older than the floodwaters that separated the First Age from everything that followed. Enmedugga is part of that claim. His name appears after Uanna in the Uruk tradition, carrying forward the sequence that began with the first sage emerging from the domain of the freshwater deep. And even without a long biography attached to him, that placement is meaningful. The Mesopotamians did not preserve these names by accident. Names had power. To write a name correctly was to identify a being precisely, to locate that being within the proper cosmic and historical order. Get the name wrong and you risk losing the connection. That is one reason the spelling matters. When we say Enmedugga, we are using a modern scholarly rendering of an ancient name. The original was written in cuneiform, a script made from wedge-shaped impressions. It was not designed to make life easy for people 3,000 or 4,000 years later. A sign could carry more than one sound. It could stand for a word, a syllable, or an idea depending on context. Scribes also used conventions that changed across time, place, and language. So ancient names often arrive with variations. You may see Uannedugga written in slightly different forms in modern books. You may see hyphens, alternate vowels, or transliterations that look more technical than familiar. That does not necessarily mean scholars are talking about different beings. It often means they are working carefully through the limits of the script, comparing tablets and deciding how best to represent a name whose original pronunciation can never be recovered with complete certainty. Imagine trying to reconstruct someone's name from a damaged document in which several letters can mean different sounds. The grammar belongs to a dead language, and the people who wrote it expected you to already know the tradition behind it. That is the world of Mesopotamian scholarship, and it gives Uannedugga's name a strange kind of weight. He is not vivid because we have a dramatic ancient biography of him. He is vivid because he survived at all, through copying, through temple archives, through collapsing walls and looted ruins, through the disappearance of the people who spoke the languages that recorded him. A name has to be copied again and again to make that journey. Someone in ancient Uruk saw it. Someone recognized that it belonged in the sequence. Someone pressed the signs into clay, and because of that act, the second sage still has a voice, however faint, in the modern world. But once you look closer at the tablet tradition, an uncomfortable question begins to emerge. What exactly did the scholars of Uruk think they were preserving when they wrote the name Uannedugga? What exactly did the scholars of Uruk think they were preserving when they wrote the name Uannedugga? The honest answer is that we cannot climb inside their minds. We do not have a tablet where a scribe pauses and says, "Here is what the second Apkallu means to me." Ancient Mesopotamian texts rarely explain themselves in the way modern historians wish they would. They assume a world of knowledge shared by trained readers, temple experts, and scribal families. The names were enough because the tradition behind the names was already known. But the position of Uannedugga tells us something important. He was second. That sounds almost too simple. Second in a list. Second after Uanna. But in Mesopotamian thought, order was never just order. Sequence could reveal rank, age, cosmic function, and the movement of authority from one generation to the next. The 7 Apkallu were not 7 disconnected monsters from a forgotten myth. They were a set, a complete body of primeval wisdom, and Uannedugga stood near its beginning. Think about the difference between being number 2 and being number 7. The 7th figure stands at the edge of a boundary. He is the last sage before the flood, the final guardian of the first world. But the 2nd sage belongs to the moment when the pattern is still taking shape. Uanna establishes the sequence. Uannedugga confirms that it was not a one-time event. The wisdom did not arrive once and vanish. It continued. That is the crucial idea. In the Apkallu tradition, the ancient world was not imagined as a primitive age slowly stumbling towards civilization. It was almost the opposite. The deepest knowledge came first. It belonged to the antediluvian age, the time before the flood, when divine order was closer to the human world and sages could move between the realms of gods, kings, temples, and the freshwater deep. Later humans inherited fragments. That is a very different story from our modern instinct to see history as progress. We tend to imagine the past as less informed, less advanced, less capable. Mesopotamian scholars could imagine the past as fuller, more complete, a time when the foundations of ritual, learning, kingship, and proper order had been laid down by beings who were not quite human in the ordinary sense. And in that model, Uannedugga is not merely the sage after the first sage. He is evidence that wisdom had a lineage. A chain needs more than an origin. Anybody can claim that some divine being taught the first humans long ago. But a sequence of 7 names does something more persuasive. It creates continuity. It says this knowledge passed through multiple ancient keepers, each one occupying a defined place in the order of the world. It is like a temple archive. One tablet alone can be lost, broken, misread, or disputed. But a whole archive arranged and copied across generations carries a different kind of authority. The 7 Apkallu functioned in a similar way. Together they formed an ancient pedigree for Mesopotamian learning itself. And Enmedugga's position near the front of that pedigree would have mattered. Not necessarily because he had a separate specialty we can identify today. We have to be careful there. It is tempting to assign every Apkallu a dramatic job description. One taught writing, one taught agriculture, one taught astronomy, one taught medicine. But the surviving evidence does not give us a clean ancient syllabus with each sage assigned to a specific invention. That is modern storytelling filling empty spaces. What the texts do support is more subtle, and in some ways more interesting. The Apkallu were associated with extraordinary wisdom. Their knowledge was linked to the gods, especially the god Ea, called Enki in Sumerian, lord of the subterranean freshwater realm known as the Apsu. Ea was connected with intelligence, ritual expertise, craft, purification, hidden things, and the dangerous power of knowing how the world really works. So when Mesopotamian scholars placed Enmedugga among the 7, they were placing him inside Ea's intellectual universe. This was not knowledge in the modern classroom sense. It was knowledge that could protect a king, purify a temple, interpret an omen, repel evil, maintain cosmic boundaries, and make the rituals of civilization work correctly. To know the right words at the right time, in the right sequence, was not trivia. It was survival. If you enjoy mysteries where the surviving evidence is real but the answers remain frustratingly incomplete, there is a book on our website about 12 unexplained mysteries. The link is in the description, because Uannedugga belongs exactly in that category, not invented, not fully understood, and far stranger the closer you look. Now picture the world that tradition creates. Before the flood there are 7 sages, not 7 kings, not 7 gods. Sages, beings defined by knowledge. They appear across a span of primordial time, connected to the earliest cities and the earliest rulers. Then the flood comes, dividing reality into before and after. The old order is destroyed. Human history begins again on the far side of catastrophe. But the wisdom survives, not untouched, not necessarily in its original fullness, but enough survives to be claimed by later scholars, priests, and exorcists. Enough that they can say, our learning is not new. Our rites have roots in the First Age. Our knowledge comes through a chain that reaches back beyond the flood. Uannedugga is one link in that chain, and yet this is where the record becomes difficult, because once we move beyond his place among the seven, the clay tablets begin to fall strangely silent. That silence is not an accident, it is the normal condition of ancient evidence. We are dealing with clay tablets that survived by chance, copied by scribes whose own copies may have been damaged, buried, reused, broken apart, or carried far from the cities where they were written. A tablet does not arrive in a museum with a complete explanation attached. It arrives as fragments, a few lines here, a broken edge there, signs missing exactly where you need them most, and with Uannedugga the gaps are enormous. We have no surviving story in which he speaks. No tablet describes his arrival from the Apsu. No ancient account gives us a physical description, a list of teachings, or a dramatic encounter with an antediluvian king. There is no Mesopotamian equivalent of a biography saying, Uannedugga did this, taught that, and vanished here. That absence matters, because it places a hard limit on what we can honestly claim. The name is ancient, the tradition is real, but the individual behind the name remains almost completely out of reach. Imagine trying to reconstruct a person from a single entry in a library catalogue. You know the book existed. You know where it belonged on the shelf. You may even know that later scholars considered it important. But the pages are gone. The argument is gone. The voice of the author is gone. What remains is a label, and the fact that somebody thought it was worth preserving. That is close to where we stand with Enmedugga. Even the surviving forms of ancient names can be difficult. Mesopotamian scribes wrote in cuneiform, a system used across multiple languages and over thousands of years. A sign could have more than one possible reading. Names could be copied with variant spellings. Later scribes sometimes preserved traditions they no longer completely understood. Modern transliterations, the Roman letter versions we read today, are scholarly attempts to represent those ancient signs. They are necessary, but they are not time machines. So when you see the name Uannedugga, it can feel solid, almost personal. It sounds like we should be able to follow him into a story. But names can be deceptive. They create the illusion of intimacy. You hear a name and your brain immediately imagines an individual, a face, a voice, a life. Yet ancient textual traditions often preserve names long after the details attached to them have disappeared. The name survives because it belongs to a sacred sequence, a learned formula, or an inherited archive. The person, if we can even call him a person, becomes a silhouette, and that is exactly what makes the Apkallu so fascinating. They stand on the border between myth, scholarship, ritual, and history. They were not historical figures in the modern sense, people whose lives can be checked against dated documents, buildings, graves, and administrative records. But they were not casual inventions either. Mesopotamian experts treated these traditions seriously enough to copy them, organize them, and connect them to their own systems of knowledge. The question is not, did Uannedugga literally walk into an ancient city as a fish-cloaked being from the deep? The tablets cannot prove that. The better question is, why did generations of highly trained scribes preserve his memory at all? And the answer seems to be authority. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, knowledge was powerful because of where it came from. A ritual gained force through correct transmission. An incantation gained force through antiquity. A scholarly practice was not merely useful because it worked. It was legitimate because it belonged to a chain reaching back toward divine origins. The Apkallu gave that chain a face, or, more accurately, 7 faces mostly hidden behind broken clay. Later ritual texts and protective traditions show that Apkallu imagery remained important long after the imagined age before the flood. Fish-cloaked figures, bird-headed protectors, and guardian sages appear in Mesopotamian art and ritual contexts. But we must not make the leap from those images to Uannedugga specifically. The broader Apkallu tradition is visible. Uannedugga, as an individual, remains obscure. That distinction is everything. It is the difference between evidence and speculation. Evidence says Mesopotamian scholars preserved an ancient sage tradition and included Uannedugga within it. Evidence says the Apkallu were connected with deep, divine protective wisdom. Evidence says later experts treated the past as a source of authority. Speculation begins when we claim to know his exact appearance, his personal teachings, the city he visited, or some secret technology he brought from another world. Could later stories have expanded on traditions now lost? Of course. Ancient Mesopotamia produced vast libraries, and only a fraction has survived. Entire genres may be gone forever. There may once have been narratives that gave Uannedugga a richer role, but may have existed is not the same as did exist. That is the frustrating beauty of this subject. Every broken tablet invites imagination. Every missing line tempts us to complete the story ourselves. But the real mystery is not solved by filling every silence with aliens, lost civilizations, or invented details. The real mystery is that a name endured across millennia, even when the story behind it did not. Enmedugga survives as a trace, a second voice in a chain of primordial wisdom. A name copied by people who believed the oldest knowledge was also the most dangerous, sacred, and powerful. And a reminder that sometimes the past does not give us answers. Sometimes it gives us fragments, then asks whether we are disciplined enough to let them remain fragments. Because after Enmedugga, another ancient name waits in the clay. And this one leads us deeper into the strange scholarly memory of Eridu. Number 3. Enmedugga, Sage of Eridu. And this time, the name leads us somewhere real. Not a vague kingdom beyond the horizon. Not a lost mountain or an unnamed island swallowed by myth. Eridu was a city. Its ruins still rise from the desert of southern Iraq near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Today it looks isolated, dry, and almost impossibly far from water. But in the deep past, this was a different world. Marshes, channels, reed beds, mud brick settlements, and the shifting waters that made life possible in southern Mesopotamia. Eridu was ancient even by Mesopotamian standards. Its earliest occupation goes back to the Ubaid period, thousands of years before the great empires of Babylon and Assyria. Long before Hammurabi, long before the first pyramids of Egypt, long before writing as we know it had fully emerged. People were building and rebuilding there, generation after generation, leaving layers of mud brick beneath the sand. And that matters because Mesopotamians themselves remembered Eridu as ancient. Not just old, primeval. In later tradition, Eridu was often treated as the first city, the place where organized human life began after kingship descended from heaven. That phrase sounds dramatic because it was supposed to. To the scribes who copied these traditions, civilization was not something humans had slowly improvised through trial and error. It had a divine beginning. Order came down from above. Cities, kingship, temples, and the structures of society had origins older than ordinary memory. Eridu stood at the beginning of that story. Think about what that means. When a civilization wants to explain where everything came from, it has choices. It can point to a battle, a great king, a mountain, a sacred tree. Mesopotamian tradition repeatedly looked toward a city in the far south, near the waters, and said in effect, "This is where the world became ordered." That doesn't mean Eridu was literally the first settlement in human history. Archaeology does not support that kind of simple claim. Human communities existed in many places long before Eridu, but myths are not excavation reports. They are maps of meaning. And in the Mesopotamian map of meaning, Eridu marked the beginning. It was associated above all with Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, the god of fresh water, craft, cunning, creation, and the hidden powers beneath the earth. His domain was the Abzu, the vast subterranean reservoir of sweet water believed to lie below the world. To modern ears, an underground ocean can sound like fantasy. But southern Mesopotamia was shaped by water in ways that are hard to overstate. Water determined where people could farm, travel, fish, build, and survive. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant floods, salt-damaged fields, and destruction. Fresh water was life. It was also mystery. It rose from springs. It moved beneath the ground. It appeared where no river could be seen. So the Abzu was not just a strange mythical location. It was a way of imagining the deep source beneath visible reality. And Eridu was placed at its edge. That connection gives Enmedugga's title an atmosphere that later retellings often miss. Sage of Eridu does not simply mean a wise man from an old town. It places him at the symbolic ground floor of Mesopotamian civilization, near the waters below the earth, near Enki's domain, near the point where divine order was believed to cross into the human world. If you enjoy these kinds of mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website, with a link waiting in the description. Because Eridu is exactly the kind of place where a historical ruin and a mythic memory overlap so completely that separating them becomes difficult. Archaeologists can uncover foundations, pottery, walls, and temples built one on top of another. They can date changing settlement patterns. They can trace how the environment shifted as rivers moved and the shoreline changed. But archaeology cannot excavate a belief. It cannot dig up the exact moment when Eridu became, in the Mesopotamian imagination, the first city. It cannot recover the first voice that said Enki dwelled beneath it. Those ideas survive through later texts, later temples, later generations, looking backward into a past already obscured by thousands of years. And that backward gaze is crucial. Eridu was not merely remembered because it was old. Plenty of places were old. It was remembered because oldness itself had power. The deeper a city reached into the past, the closer it seemed to stand to divine beginnings. In a world where authority depended on origin, Eridu possessed the oldest origin imaginable. Which raises a question: when Enmedugga is connected to Eridu, are we looking at a figure tied to a particular ancient place? Or are we looking at something even stranger? A name deliberately placed at civilization's first threshold, where myth says humanity received the order that made cities possible? To answer that, we have to look more closely at how Enmedugga appears in the surviving Mesopotamian record. The surviving record does not give us a biography of Enmedugga. There is no tablet that says where he was born, what he looked like, how long he ruled, or which great event he witnessed. No speech in his own voice, no grave that can be identified as his. What we have instead is something both less satisfying and more intriguing: a name in a list. And in ancient Mesopotamia, lists were never just lists. Scribes made lists of kings, gods, cities, stars, plants, stones, professions, omens, temple personnel, and words from languages already becoming ancient. A list could preserve information, but it could also establish order. It told you what belonged where, what came first, what came after. Which names deserve to be remembered together? Enmedugga appears in lists of the 7 antediluvian Apkallu, the sages said to have existed before the Great Flood. His name is usually written in Sumerian signs as Enmedugga. That looks deceptively simple. 4 signs, 4 syllables, at least in the conventional modern reading. But cuneiform is not an alphabet. A single sign can carry multiple values, and ancient scribes used signs as sounds, as whole words, or as inherited scholarly notation. Translating a name is not always like reading a label. Sometimes it is more like reconstructing a code from a civilization separated from us by 5,000 years. The first element, N, can mean Lord. The middle sign, Me, is especially important in Mesopotamian thought, though we should be careful not to force a neat translation onto a divine or legendary name. In Sumerian literature, the Me were the fundamental powers, offices and cultural capacities that made an ordered world possible. Kingship, priesthood, craft, judgment, music, warfare, truth. The structures that turned scattered human beings into a society. Then comes Dugga, a word often associated with goodness, sweetness, or something favourable. So modern readers sometimes see Enmedugga and hear a title like meaning Lord of the Good Powers or Lord of the Beneficial Me. But that is interpretation, not certainty. Ancient names can preserve old wordplay, religious associations, or linguistic forms whose original meaning was already obscure to the scribes copying them. Still, the name was not random. It was preserved as the third entry in a sequence. Uanna comes first, Uannedugga comes second, then Enmedugga. That placement matters. The Apkallu were not presented as a crowd of interchangeable fishmen emerging from mythic waters whenever a storyteller needed one. They had an order, a succession, 7 figures, each named, each placed in a fixed position in the age before the flood. Imagine copying this list onto a clay tablet. You are a scribe in First-Millennium Mesopotamia, perhaps in Assyria or Babylonia, working centuries after the earliest Sumerian cities had risen and fallen. The names you write are already unimaginably old. Their language belongs to a past your own people study in school. Yet you preserve every sign because the sequence itself carries authority. First Uanna, then Uannedugga, then Enmedugga. Not because anyone expects you to prove these beings existed in the modern historical sense. That was not the point. The point was that the world had a deep structure. Before ordinary kings, before recorded dynasties, before the flood divided time into a before and an after, there had been sages, and Enmedugga had a place among them. One of the most important surviving sources is a scholarly and ritual composition modern researchers call Beit Mezari, often translated as House of Confinement. The text survives in damaged first-millennium copies, which means we are dealing with fragments, reconstructions, and the patient work of Assyriologists comparing signs across tablets. It is not a pristine book dropped intact from antiquity. It is a puzzle assembled from clay, but the puzzle preserves the names of the 7 Apkallu, and Enmedugga is there. That is stronger evidence than a modern retelling, but it also has limits. The tablets prove that Mesopotamian scholars recognized Enmedugga as part of this ancient sequence. They do not prove that he was a historical person walking through prehistoric Eridu. They do not tell us whether the tradition began as memory, myth, priestly symbolism, or some mixture of all three. This is where people often make the story simpler than the evidence allows. They see a name on a tablet and say, "There." The ancient Sumerians recorded an actual teacher from before Adam, but the tablets do not say that. Then skeptics make the opposite mistake. They see mythic language and decide the names are meaningless inventions, nothing more than fantasy. But that does not follow either. A name repeated and carefully ordered across a scribal tradition has meaning, even when we cannot recover every layer of that meaning. Enmedugga belonged to a framework that Mesopotamian scholars considered important enough to copy, preserve, and connect to the deepest age of their world. And the deeper we look into that framework, the stranger the wording becomes. Because Enmedugga was not only one name among 7. In the texts, the Apkallu are defined by what they were believed to be. They were believed to be bearers of sacred learning, not just clever men, not inventors in the ordinary sense. The Apkallu belonged to a category of knowledge that came from beyond ordinary human experience. In Mesopotamian thought, the most important arts of civilization were never completely human possessions. They were gifts, powers, secrets entrusted to humanity by the gods. That distinction changes everything. Today, when we say someone is wise, we usually mean they have learned a great deal through observation, study, experience, maybe a few painful mistakes. But ancient Mesopotamian wisdom had another dimension. Knowledge could be dangerous. It could protect a city, heal an illness, interpret a bad omen, purify a temple, or identify the invisible force thought to be causing disaster. But in the wrong hands or used incorrectly, it could bring exactly the opposite result. This was sacred learning, knowledge with consequences. And Enmedugga, as one of the Apkallu, stood inside that world. The texts do not preserve a lecture by Enmedugga. They do not say, "This is the particular ritual he taught," or "This is the tablet he wrote." We have to be honest about that. But the wider Apkallu tradition repeatedly connects these primeval sages with divine wisdom, ritual expertise, and the foundations of learned culture. In later Mesopotamian scholarship, the word Apkallu could even be used for a human expert, especially a learned ritual practitioner. That does not mean every priest or scribe was believed to be one of the original flood before sages. Far from it. The primeval Apkallu were unique, but human scholars could be understood as inheritors of their tradition. Think about what that means. A scribe copying an ancient incantation was not merely duplicating words. He could believe he was maintaining a chain of knowledge that reached back beyond kings, beyond cities, beyond the flood itself. A ritual specialist reciting prayers over a sick person was not simply performing medicine as we would understand it. He was working within a sacred system, one whose authority came from the gods, and whose deepest origins were placed in the primeval age. That was the role the Apkallu served. They made learning ancient. They made it divine, and they made it necessary for the survival of civilization. There is a reason Mesopotamian temples were not only places of worship. They were also archives, schools, workshops, economic centers, and institutions of memory. Clay tablets recorded contracts and grain deliveries. Yes. But they also carried hymns, prayers, lexical lists, omens, rituals, astronomical observations, and medical prescriptions. Knowledge was organized, guarded, copied, and passed down because knowledge itself was part of cosmic order. If you want to explore more mysteries where the evidence gets stranger the deeper you go, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. Now, Enmedugga's name may be ancient and difficult to interpret, but his placement among the Apkallu tells us how later scholars wanted him remembered, not as a wandering philosopher offering private advice, not as a king claiming wisdom for himself, but as part of a lineage of sacred teachers whose existence explained why human beings possessed the tools of ordered life in the first place. Writing, ritual, law, craft, the ability to recognize signs from the gods, the ability to respond when the world seemed out of balance. For Mesopotamians, These things did not emerge by accident. Civilization was fragile, rivers flooded unpredictably, crops failed, disease appeared without warning, armies could arrive over the horizon. A bad omen, an eclipse, the birth of an unusual animal, a nightmare experienced by the king, all could be treated as signals requiring expert interpretation. To live in such a world was to believe that ignorance was not harmless. Ignorance could leave you exposed. The sage, then, was more than a teacher. He was a guardian against chaos. And this is why the Apkallu were so often associated in Mesopotamian art and ritual imagination with protective power. Their strange hybrid forms in later imagery, part human and part fish or bird, were not evidence that ancient artists were documenting biological creatures. They were symbols of beings who crossed boundaries between water and land, wilderness and city, the divine realm and the human one. Enmedugga belongs to that boundary. He is a name from a legendary age, but his importance lies in what the name carried forward. Every later scholar who treated ancient learning as sacred tradition could see the Apkallu as predecessors. Every ritual designed to restore order could echo the idea that wisdom had once been delivered to humanity by beings closer to the gods than ordinary people could ever be. That does not prove Enmedugga was a literal teacher living before recorded history, but it proves something real about the civilization that preserved him. The people of Mesopotamia did not imagine knowledge as a modern invention, climbing steadily upward from primitive ignorance. They imagined that the deepest wisdom was older than the present, older than memory, and partly lost. Their scholars were not just discovering new things. They were recovering, protecting, and correctly transmitting what the ancient sages had already known. And Enmedugga was one of those sages, the third name in the chain. A figure whose surviving record is thin, whose original meaning remains uncertain, but whose connection to sacred learning was powerful enough to endure across millennia. Then comes the next name, and with it, the tradition begins to reveal an even sharper connection between primeval wisdom, ritual authority, and the people who claim to preserve it. Number 4. Enmegalamma, the Third-Millennium tradition. The name sounds strange to us. Ancient, heavy, like something pulled from the bottom of a river, along with broken bricks and buried foundations. Enmegalamma. And that is exactly why it matters, because names are fragile. Empires disappear, cities collapse, temples burn, languages change. A name can vanish in a single generation if nobody repeats it. Nobody writes it down. Nobody decides it is worth carrying forward. Yet Enmegalamma was carried forward, not necessarily because later Mesopotamians knew anything we would call biographical detail. They did not preserve a childhood, a face, a birthplace, or a list of personal achievements. Enmegalamma survives because learned people placed his name inside a tradition, a chain, a sequence of sages believed to have existed before the flood and to have brought essential knowledge into the human world. That is scholarly transmission, and it is more impressive than it first appears. Imagine the work required to preserve a difficult ancient name across centuries. Scribes had to learn the signs. They had to recognize the sequence. They had to copy it accurately enough that another scribe, perhaps generations later, could recognize it again. Teachers had to train students in old literary and ritual traditions. Temple libraries had to preserve tablets. Scholars had to decide that these strange names from the distant past still belonged in the body of knowledge worth protecting. This was not casual storytelling around a fire. Mesopotamia had storytelling, of course. Great stories. Stories of gods, heroes, monsters, floods, journeys into the underworld. But the Apkallu names appear within learned traditions connected to scribal culture, ritual knowledge, and the deep history of civilization. Enmegalamma was not remembered simply as a character in a popular tale. He was remembered as one entry in a formal ancestral order. That difference matters. A popular story can change every time someone tells it. One generation adds a detail, another removes one. A hero becomes stronger, a monster becomes larger. Eventually, nobody knows where the original story ended, and later imagination began. But scribal culture works differently. A tablet is not perfect. Scribes could make mistakes. They could update spellings, combine traditions, or copy from damaged exemplars. Ancient scholarship was still done by human beings, and human beings have always been capable of getting things wrong. But the very act of copying creates resistance against total forgetting. It gives memory a physical form. Wet clay receives the signs. The clay dries. A later reader traces the same marks with his eyes. Then another tablet is made, and another. A name crosses time. That is the world Enmegalamma entered. The Mesopotamian scholar was not just a writer in the modern sense. He was part librarian, part teacher, part archivist, part ritual expert, part investigator of a universe believed to be full of messages. He copied lexical lists that organized words and signs. He studied omens recorded from earlier generations. He learned hymns in archaic forms of language. He preserved rituals whose authority depended partly on their antiquity. And behind all of this stood an idea. The oldest knowledge was often the most powerful. Not always easy to understand. Not always available. But powerful. Think about a modern scientific archive. A researcher may consult papers written decades ago, compare results, verify methods, and build on what came before. Now imagine that same respect for accumulated knowledge mixed with religion, royal authority, ritual danger, and the belief that civilization itself had been handed down from divine beings before history began. That was something closer to the Mesopotamian intellectual world. For a learned scribe, the names of the Apkallu were not random decoration. They helped anchor a claim about where expertise came from. The arts of civilization had precedents. Ritual knowledge had predecessors. The scholar in the temple school was not inventing wisdom from nothing. He was receiving it through a chain that reached backward into an age before ordinary human kingship. Enmegalamma was one link in that chain. And notice what this does to the word memory. We usually think memory belongs to a person. You remember a face? You remember a place? You remember what happened when you were a child. But civilizations have memories too. Not biological memories. Institutional memories. Memories stored in buildings, customs, ceremonies, archives, and repeated names. A city can remember something no living person witnessed. That does not mean the memory is historically exact in every detail. It means the memory has been judged important enough to survive. And survival is never automatic. Every tablet copied, every list taught, every ritual repeated was a choice made against oblivion. Enmegalamma's preserved name tells us that later scholars made that choice. They looked back into the imagined world before the flood and saw not silence, but teachers. They saw a lineage of sages, and they kept reciting the names. But then the question becomes more complicated. If these names were preserved through scholarly tradition, what exactly were later scribes trying to preserve? Historical individuals, sacred archetypes, inherited ritual authority, or all of those things at once? That is where Enmegalamma's place in the tradition starts to become genuinely strange. Maybe the answer begins with the numbers, because in Mesopotamian tradition, the age before the flood was not merely described as old. It was described as unimaginably old. Not centuries. Not even thousands of years. The antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list were said to rule for periods so vast they make the reigns of later historical kings look like brief interruptions. According to one famous version of the list, kingship first descended from heaven at Eridu. Then came a sequence of early cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Zimbir, and Shuruppak. 8 kings ruled in those 5 cities before the flood swept over the land. Their combined reigns add up to 241,200 years. Then the tablet says it with terrifying simplicity: the flood swept over. After that, kingship descended from heaven again. But the numbers changed. Later rulers might reign for hundreds of years in the literary record, then decades, then the more recognizable spans associated with actual dynasties. History, at least as the Mesopotamians imagined it, begins in a world where time itself has been broken. Before the flood, everything is larger. The reigns are larger. The cities carry a deeper authority. The sages stand closer to the origin of civilization. And Enmegalamma belongs to that immense first age. Now, it would be easy to make the wrong move here. To take 241,200 years, put it on a timeline, count backward from a proposed date for the flood, and announce that we have discovered the exact year Enmegalamma walked the earth. We have not. These ancient numbers are not modern chronologies, in the sense of a dated historical archive. They are part of a sacred historical framework. They communicate distance. They communicate grandeur. They tell the audience that the world before the flood operated under different conditions, with a different scale of time, and a much closer relationship between humanity and the divine. Think about what a number like 36,000 years does in a king list. It does not just say, "This king ruled a long time." It says, "Do not measure this king by ordinary human standards. This belongs to an age before the boundary, before catastrophe divided the first world from the world we know, and the sages belong on the same side of that boundary." Later texts associate the 7 Apkallu with the first 7 antediluvian kings. The exact relationship can be complicated, and surviving traditions do not always line up in a perfectly neat one-to-one chart. But the larger pattern is clear. A primordial ruler presides. A sage appears beside him. Kingship and wisdom arrive together. That is crucial. The Apkallu are not presented as random visitors wandering through a prehistoric wilderness. They are tied to the first organized human world: cities, temples, rulership, ritual, law, and the skills required to sustain civilization. Enmegalamma's place in the sequence tells us that his authority was imagined as ancient, even within an already ancient story. He was not simply from the past. He was from the past before the flood. And for Mesopotamians, the flood was more than a disaster. It was a dividing line in reality. On one side stood the founding age, when divine knowledge entered the human world. On the other stood the damaged world of ordinary kings, ordinary lifespans, lost cities, and incomplete memory. That basic structure will sound familiar to anyone who knows later flood traditions. A world exists before the great catastrophe. Exceptional figures receive or possess sacred knowledge. A flood destroys the old order. A remnant survives. Civilization begins again. But we need to be careful not to flatten these traditions into one single story. Mesopotamian texts developed across many centuries, in different cities, languages, and political worlds. The biblical flood narrative is not a word-for-word copy of a Sumerian list. Greek writers later told their own versions, and each tradition used the flood to ask different questions about divine judgment, human survival, royal legitimacy, and the origins of knowledge. Still, the recurring pattern is impossible to ignore. Humanity remembers a break, a threshold. Something was known before the waters came, and only fragments remained afterward. That is one reason the Apkallu were so powerful in later ritual imagination. They represented knowledge from before the break. knowledge older than the current order. Knowledge with an authority no ordinary scholar, king or priest could claim for himself. And if you enjoy following these strange historical patterns, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, with the link in the description. Because the deeper you go into ancient traditions, the more often you find the same unsettling idea. The past was not seen as primitive. It was seen as lost. Now look again at Enmegalamma's position. He appears fourth in the sequence of 7, not at the beginning where the first act of civilization takes place, not at the end, standing closest to the flood. He occupies the middle of the primordial age. That may sound like a minor detail, but in ancient ordered lists, position matters. The sequence itself creates meaning, first establishes origins, last approaches catastrophe. The middle suggests continuity, a long, stable world in which the knowledge brought by the earliest sages was not lost immediately, but expanded, maintained, and passed through successive generations. Enmegalamma stands inside that long before time, a world of colossal reigns, city foundations, divine institutions, and sages whose wisdom was believed to have existed before human history became the fragile, broken thing later people inherited. But there is another problem waiting beneath those enormous numbers. If the antediluvian age was so distant, so grand, and so different from ordinary time, how did Mesopotamian scholars decide where one sage belonged, which king he served, and what kind of knowledge each figure was supposed to carry? The honest answer is that they often could not know in the way we mean knowing. They did not have a complete archive stretching back to the beginning of the world. They had tablets, fragments, copies of copies, ritual texts, scholarly lists, myths, commentaries, and damaged pieces of clay recovered from cities that had themselves been destroyed, rebuilt, conquered, abandoned, and buried. That is the first limit we have to face. The Mesopotamian record is enormous by ancient standards. Hundreds of thousands of tablets and fragments have been recovered. But enormous does not mean complete. In fact, it can create the opposite illusion. You see shelves full of inscribed clay, and imagine a library where every question has an answer. But many tablets are broken. Many have no clear archaeological context. Many are still untranslated. And for every text preserved by accident in a burned palace or collapsed temple archive, countless others were dissolved by water, crushed into dust, or reused as building fill. Clay is durable, but it is not immortal. A tablet can survive for thousands of years if fire hardens it, if dry soil protects it, if nobody digs through it, if no flood scatters it, if no later builders grind it into rubble. That is a lot of ifs. What survives is not a neutral sample of everything Mesopotamians once wrote. It is a tiny, distorted selection shaped by catastrophe and chance. Think about that for a moment. The people who made these traditions may have possessed versions we no longer have. Explanations attached to names that now stand alone. Longer narratives about individual Apkallu. Temple recitations that were never committed to clay, or clay tablets that did not survive their final night above ground. Enmegalamma's name has survived, but survival of a name is not survival of a biography. We do not have a tablet where Enmegalamma introduces himself, tells us where he came from, describes what he taught, and gives us the exact events of his life. We do not have an eyewitness record from an antediluvian city. We do not even have one single master document that neatly explains all 7 sages without ambiguity. What we have is more difficult and in some ways more interesting. We have traces. A name appears in a sequence. A ritual object carries the image of a fish-cloaked protective being. A learned text speaks of sages from before the flood. A later writer preserves a tradition in a different language. Pieces from different centuries seem to point toward a shared idea. Civilization had received knowledge from figures who belonged to the first world. But the details do not always agree. Some texts give names with variant spellings. Some lists are incomplete. Some traditions emphasize 7 primeval sages, while others expand the story with later figures who lived after the flood and were no longer fully divine. One source may attach a sage to a king. Another may focus on a city, a ritual role, or a body of sacred expertise. This does not automatically mean someone was lying, or that the tradition was meaningless. Ancient traditions were living systems. They changed as scribes interpreted, organized, and adapted inherited material for new audiences. And that means we have to resist a very modern temptation. When the evidence contains a gap, people want to fill it. They want to say Enmegalamma must have taught astronomy, or metalworking, or medicine, or the secret architecture of the first temples. Maybe he did in some lost tradition. Maybe later storytellers would have imagined exactly that. But maybe is not the same thing as evidence. The surviving texts do not give us permission to turn every blank space into a revelation. This is where the story becomes more mysterious, not less. Because Enmegalamma exists at the edge of what can be recovered. He is not a historical ruler with inscriptions, monuments, tax records, letters, and a tomb. He is a figure in sacred memory, a name carried through an intellectual world that understood itself as standing after a great rupture. The tablets do not let us step cleanly into the world before the flood. They let us see what people after the flood believed had been there. That difference matters. It is the difference between archaeology and memory. Archaeology asks what objects remain from the past. Memory asks what later people refuse to forget. Enmegalamma belongs to the second category. His name tells us less about a provable individual, and more about the Mesopotamian conviction that wisdom had an origin older than ordinary history. And perhaps that is why these figures remained so compelling. A king can lose a war, a city can vanish beneath the sand. A dynasty can be erased from political memory. But a sage from before the flood belongs to a deeper kind of authority. He cannot be challenged by a rival kingdom, or replaced by a newer ruler. He comes from the age when the foundations were laid. Still, we should not confuse reverence with certainty. The limits of the tablets are real. They prevent us from claiming that Enmegalamma was an extraterrestrial visitor, a literal fish-man, or a documented teacher who arrived in a year we can calculate. Those claims go far beyond the evidence. The ancient texts give us a powerful tradition, not a modern case file. But they do give us something remarkable. They show a civilization looking backward across an imagined abyss, and insisting that knowledge did not begin with the people living now. It came from before. It had been delivered, preserved imperfectly, and carried forward through a damaged world. And Enmegalamma, fourth among the 7, remained one of the names still visible through the dust. Number 5, Enmebulugga, the 5th Apkallu. After Enmegalamma, the sequence moves to a name that is even more difficult to bring into focus. Enmebulugga. In the standard list of the 7 primeval sages, he stands 5th. Not first, not last, not attached to the beginning of the chain or its final dramatic threshold. He occupies the middle ground, one name among a sacred sequence that Mesopotamian scholars treated as older than ordinary human memory. And that position is almost everything we can say with confidence. The surviving traditions preserve Enmebulugga as the 5th Apkallu, following Enmegalamma and preceding An-Enlilda. His name appears in lists of the 7 sages associated with the ancient city of Eridu and its earliest kings. That sounds straightforward, but ancient lists are not just lists. They are compressed worlds. A few names in the right order could carry an entire theory about where knowledge came from, who possessed it first, and why later generations believed their own wisdom had ancient authority. Think about what a list does today. We see a numbered sequence and assume it is just a tool for organizing information. First, second, third, fourth. But in the ancient world, order could be meaningful in ways we easily miss. Order could establish rank. It could establish inheritance. It could show the movement of an office from one holder to the next. It could map a chain of transmission, teacher to student, priest to priest, king to king, generation to generation. So when Enmebulugga is named fifth, that does not prove he was the fifth individual to physically arrive somewhere, or that he ruled over a precisely measured span of years. The tablets do not give us that kind of detail, but it does place him within a carefully maintained succession. He was not an isolated wonder. He belonged to a system in which primeval wisdom was distributed across multiple figures, each one preserving the continuity of a knowledge that later people believed had existed from the very beginning. That distinction matters. It is tempting to imagine each Apkallu as having one special assignment. One teaches writing, another teaches agriculture, another reveals the stars, another lays out the first temple plan. It makes for a clean story, almost too clean. The problem is that the surviving evidence does not neatly divide their responsibilities that way. Enmebulugga's name survives, but a personal portfolio does not. No known text gives us a detailed speech from Enmebulugga explaining his particular invention, his sacred lesson, or his individual mission. And that silence has invited speculation for centuries. People see a gap in the record and rush to fill it. Maybe Enmebulugga was the keeper of lost science. Maybe he was a master builder. Maybe he was connected to hidden tablets, astronomical codes, or knowledge deliberately withheld from later humanity. Those ideas can be fascinating, but fascination is not evidence. The ancient material gives us a name and a position inside a primeval lineage. Beyond that, we have to move carefully, because sometimes the strangest thing is not what a text says. It is what it refuses to explain. Enmebulugga is a perfect example. Imagine finding a list from thousands of years ago that names the first guardians of all civilization, and one of those names is preserved with no biography attached. No birthplace, no death, no monument, no story of a battle, a journey, or a revelation. Just a place in the order, fifth. That can feel frustrating. But it also tells us something about the scribes who copied these traditions. They may not have needed an explanation. To them, the name itself may have carried authority. It may have been recognized by trained scholars the same way a sacred title, a revered ancestor, or a line from an ancient prayer carries meaning within a tradition, even when outsiders no longer understand every reference. And this is one reason the Apkallu tradition is so hard to translate into modern categories. Were these sages gods? Not exactly. Were they human? Not in the normal sense. Were they priests, culture heroes, mythic ancestors, or divine agents working through human civilization? Different texts emphasize different aspects. The Apkallu belong to that ancient Mesopotamian borderland where categories blur. They are connected with divine wisdom, ritual protection, and the deep past. They are remembered as beings whose authority preceded later institutions, later kings, and later scholarly systems. Enmebulugga's fifth position places him directly inside that borderland. Not outside the chain, looking in. Not a later addition standing apart from the old tradition. He is woven into its centre. His name helps hold the sequence together, linking the sages before him to those who come after. And if you want to understand why Mesopotamian scholars kept preserving names like his, we need to look more closely at what that sequence was actually doing for them, because the next question is not simply who Enmebulugga was. It is why a name with so little surviving story could still endure for millennia. The answer lies in the great dividing line of Mesopotamian memory. The flood. For ancient Mesopotamian scholars, the flood was not just a disaster story. It was the border between two worlds. On one side stood the First Age, the age when kingship descended from heaven. Cities were established in their primordial forms, and the Apkallu moved among humanity. On the other side stood the historical world, the world of later dynasties, ruined cities, rival kingdoms, wars, famines, and written records that scribes could still trace through recognizable lines of succession. The flood stood between them like a wall, and Enmebulugga belongs on the far side of that wall. This is where the tradition becomes more complicated than the version many people know from later biblical stories. Mesopotamia had flood stories long before the book of Genesis was written down in its final form. The names changed, the gods changed, the reasons for the disaster changed. But the basic structure remained remarkably powerful. Humanity existed. The gods decided a flood would come. One man received a warning. He built a great vessel. Life was preserved, the waters receded, the world began again. In the Sumerian tradition, that survivor was often called Ziusudra. In Akkadian versions, he becomes Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how the god Ea secretly warned him that the divine assembly had chosen to destroy humanity. He was told to tear down his house, build a boat, bring aboard family, animals, craftsmen, and the seeds of living things, then survive a storm so overwhelming that even the gods were said to fear it. But the flood did not simply erase the past, it reorganized it. That is the crucial idea. The Sumerian king list, one of the most famous texts from ancient Iraq, presents kingship as something that came down from heaven. It begins in the city of Eridu, the same ancient city repeatedly associated with the Apkallu tradition. Then it names rulers who supposedly reigned for spans so vast. They are almost impossible to imagine. Not decades, not centuries, tens of thousands of years. Then comes a simple, devastating line. The flood swept over. After that, kingship descends again. The list continues with post-flood cities and rulers, gradually moving toward names and places that look more familiar to historians. This was not a modern chronological record. Nobody should read those enormous reign lengths as literal dates on a calendar. The figures are part of a mythic system, a way of saying that the first age was greater, more distant, and more sacred than anything that came after. Before the waters rose, time itself operated on a different scale. The rulers were not merely old, they belonged to an age beyond ordinary human measurement, and the sages belonged there too. That is why their names were preserved. Not because every later scribe had access to a biography of each Apkallu, but because they represented the continuity of knowledge across the break. The world before the flood was not imagined as primitive. Quite the opposite. It was often imagined as the source of civilization's deepest wisdom. Temples, rituals, royal authority, expert knowledge, protective rights, and the correct ordering of the world all reached backward toward that lost age. The flood destroyed humanity's first world, but it did not destroy its memory. Or at least that is what the scribes were trying to prevent. A tablet is a strange kind of survival machine. A city can burn. A temple can collapse. A kingdom can disappear so completely that its language has to be rediscovered thousands of years later. But if a clay tablet is baked in a fire, the very destruction that wipes out the building can harden the text inside it. Disaster can accidentally preserve memory. That is one reason these ancient traditions feel so haunting. The people who wrote them were already looking backward across an impossible distance. They believed there had been a world before their own world, teachers before their teachers, kings before their kings. And they believed a catastrophe had separated them from it. If you're drawn to mysteries where history, myth, and unanswered questions collide, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description now. We need to be precise here. Archaeologists have found evidence of serious flooding at several ancient Mesopotamian sites. Places like Shuruppak, and Kish preserve flood deposits from different periods. But those layers do not prove one single flood covered the entire planet at one moment in time. Mesopotamia was a land shaped by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates gave life, but they could also change course, burst their banks, destroy fields, and bury settlements under mud. For a city living beside those rivers, a regional flood could feel like the end of everything. Imagine it. Your fields vanish. Your houses collapse. The temple storerooms are ruined. Bodies and animals are carried away. The boundaries between land and water disappear. Every road you knew is gone. For the survivors, the whole world really may have ended, because the whole world they knew was the world around them. Over generations, memories of many disasters can merge. Local floods, political collapse, famine, migration, and the terror of river water can be gathered into one enormous sacred story. A story not just about destruction, but about what had existed before destruction came. And that is the framework surrounding Enmebulugga. He is not preserved as a figure walking through the familiar landscape of later Mesopotamian history. He belongs to the age before the waters, before the reset, before kingship returned to earth in its later form. To understand what that meant for the Apkallu, we have to follow the sages across the flood line itself. Across that line, the sages become more than individual names. They become a number, 7. And in ancient Mesopotamia, 7 was never just a convenient total. It was one of the numbers used to organize the universe itself. 7 appeared in lists of divine powers, in ritual formulas in the movements of the heavens, in the dangerous forces that could threaten a king or a city, and in the sacred patterns used to make an invisible world understandable. The Apkallu were 7 because 7 told the listener that these were not random teachers. They were complete. Think about what a list does. A list can preserve names, but it can also impose order. It takes scattered traditions, stories from different cities, fragments of priestly knowledge, and turns them into a sequence that can be memorized, copied, taught, and repeated for centuries. Once the sages became the 7 Apkallu, they were no longer merely figures from an unreachable first age. They became a sacred system, a complete chain of transmission. The tradition usually names 7 primeval sages before the flood, with each connected to one of the earliest cities in the king list tradition. Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These were not just dots on a map. They were markers in Mesopotamian cultural memory, places where kingship, temple authority, and human knowledge had supposedly taken root at the beginning of time. The sages moved through that landscape like bearers of a lost inheritance, and Enmebulugga is one link in that chain. That matters because a chain is only as powerful as its continuity. The 5th sage does not need a surviving epic of his own to have significance. His name helps maintain the pattern. He confirms that the primordial teaching did not arrive in one sudden moment and then vanish. It unfolded in stages, across cities, across reigns, through a complete sequence of 7 figures who stood at the beginning of civilization. But why 7 specifically? The honest answer is that we cannot point to one ancient tablet where a Mesopotamian scholar says, here is exactly why the Apkallu were 7. Ancient traditions rarely explain themselves that neatly. What we can see is the wider symbolic world in which the number operated. Mesopotamian observers looked up and saw 7 major celestial bodies moving against the fixed stars, the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These were not just lights in the sky, they were divine powers, signs that could shape the fate of rulers and nations. The 7-day rhythm that later became familiar across much of the world also has deep roots in the importance assigned to these heavenly bodies. Though the history is more complicated than a single invention at a single moment. 7 was visible above them. It was repeated below them. There were also the Sabeti, often translated as the Seven, a powerful and sometimes terrifying group of divine or semi-divine figures. In incantations and ritual texts, groups of 7 could represent forces that had to be invoked, controlled, or driven away. 7 appears again and again because it marked a set with cosmic weight. A number that suggested totality, danger, authority, or sacred completion. That does not mean the 7 Apkallu was simply another version of the Sabeti. They had different roles, different traditions, and different symbolic identities. The Apkallu were primarily bearers of wisdom, ritual knowledge, and the civilizing arts. But they existed in a culture where 7 already carried enormous religious force. So when a scholar listed 7 sages before the flood, the number itself was making a claim. This wisdom was not partial. This was not the knowledge of one clever ancestor, one local priest, or one forgotten city. It was the full inheritance of the first world. That idea survived long after the original stories became difficult to trace. In First-Millennium Assyrian and Babylonian ritual texts, Apkallu figures appear as protectors. Small figurines were buried beneath floors, placed near doors, and positioned around buildings to guard against evil. Some were depicted in fish cloaks, echoing the old image of Uanna rising from the sea. Others had bird-like features or human forms. Their exact meanings could shift depending on the ritual, but their purpose was clear. They guarded ordered space against chaos, and that is the deepest reason the old sages mattered. Mesopotamian civilization lived with constant reminders that order could fail. Rivers flooded, crops died, empires fell, enemies crossed the plains. Disease entered homes without warning. The world was productive but never secure. The Apkallu represented the opposite of that uncertainty. They were proof, at least in sacred memory, that knowledge had existed from the beginning. That the rituals were not improvised, that the temple did not stand alone against chaos. That kingship, craft, writing, measurement, and proper worship had roots deeper than any living dynasty. Enmebulugga's name is one small surviving piece of that immense claim, a name pressed into clay, repeated in learned lists, carried forward because the sequence had to remain whole. 5 sages have now passed through the memory of the first world. But the pattern is not complete yet. 2 names remain, and as the final members of the 7 appear, the tradition begins moving closer to the moment when primordial wisdom meets catastrophe. Number 6. An-Enlilda, the 6th sage. After Enmebulugga, the sequence gives us a name that feels different the moment you hear it. Not because we have a dramatic story attached to it. We don't. No surviving tablet tells us what An-Enlilda said on his first day among humanity. No epic describes him stepping out of the sea. No inscription gives us a biography, a family line, or a list of inventions credited directly to him. What survives is his name, and in Mesopotamia, names were rarely empty. They could preserve places, titles, family histories, old languages, political claims, and religious ideas long after the original context had faded. A name was like a sealed clay tablet. Even when the story around it was broken, something important might still be pressed into the surface. An-Enlilda is one of those names. The most striking part is right at the beginning. An, in Sumerian religious language, An was the great sky god, one of the highest divine powers in the Mesopotamian universe. His name could also mean heaven or sky. That gives the first element of An-Enlilda an immediate sense of height, distance, and authority. This is not the language of ordinary daily life. It is language that points upward. Then comes Enlil. Enlil was another of the central names in Mesopotamian religion. His name is often understood through the elements En, meaning Lord, and Lil, a word connected with wind, air, or breath. Enlil was associated with command, kingship, decrees, storms, and the force that moved between heaven and earth. If An was the high sky, Enlil was the power of the atmosphere, the invisible force that could bring life-giving rain or destroy a city with flood and wind. So stop for a second and think about what is packed into this one name. Sky, lordship, wind, divine authority. The sixth Apkallu appears in the old sequence carrying a name built from some of the most powerful vocabulary in the Sumerian world. Now, we need to be careful here. Ancient names do not always work like modern sentences. You can't necessarily take each element, translate it word for word, and assume you've recovered a simple statement. Names can be archaic. They can preserve grammar that later scribes no longer used in ordinary speech. They can be shortened forms of longer phrases, and sometimes a name survives after the exact meaning that once made it clear has been lost. But even with that caution, the divine elements are hard to miss. An-Enlilda does not sound like a craftsman from a village, a fisherman from the marshes, or a king remembered for one battle. His name belongs in a sacred landscape, where heaven, wind, rulership, and cosmic order were not separate ideas. They were parts of the same system, and that system shaped everything. Mesopotamian people lived beneath enormous skies. Flat plains stretched toward horizons that seemed to have no end. Storms could arrive across open land with terrifying speed. The Tigris and Euphrates brought water, transport, fertile soil, and trade. But they could also overflow, shift course, and destroy fields in a single season. For people living there, the sky was not background scenery. Wind was not just weather. These were powers. They determined where the grain grew, where the roofs held, where the boats travelled, where the canals filled, whether armies could march, whether a city endured another year. That is why divine names mattered so much. They named the forces that stood behind the visible world, the forces no human ruler could fully control. And An-Enlilda stands near the end of the primordial list, just before the final sage and just before the great break in Mesopotamian sacred history, the flood. That position gives the name a strange weight. 6th out of 7. Almost at the end of the first age, almost at the threshold. If you want to go deeper into mysteries where ancient texts, lost traditions, and unanswered questions overlap, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. But back to the clay tablets. The names of the Apkallu were copied by scribes who treated the deep past as something worth preserving. Not history in the modern sense, with dates, eyewitnesses, and archives. We can verify line by line. Something older and more powerful in their eyes, inherited knowledge, a map of where civilization came from. And within that map, An-Enlilda's name may preserve a clue about the kind of world the sages inhabited. Not a world divided neatly between human skill and divine power. A world where the names of the oldest teachers could echo the names of heaven itself. The question is, what that echo meant to the people who copied it. To understand that, you have to step inside the Mesopotamian sacred universe. The gods were not distant figures who occasionally appeared in stories. They were the structure behind reality itself. Every city had its divine patron. Every temple was understood as that god's earthly household. The fields, canals, livestock, births, illnesses, storms, royal victories, and sudden disasters all existed within a world governed by powers greater than humanity. And the Apkallu belonged to that world. They were not gods in the straightforward sense. The ancient sources do not simply call them gods and leave it there. But they were also not ordinary human teachers. They occupied the space in between. Beings of primeval wisdom, figures connected to the age before the flood. Mediators between the divine realm and the first human cities. That middle position is the key in Mesopotamian thought. Civilization was not something humans invented alone through slow trial and error. Writing, kingship, temple ritual, farming, law, craftsmanship, and the ordered life of the city could all be understood as gifts with divine origins. Humanity used these things. Humanity preserved them. Humanity sometimes forgot them, but the deepest knowledge came from elsewhere. The Apkallu were remembered as the carriers of that knowledge. Their earliest home in tradition was Eridu, the ancient southern city associated with Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea. Enki was one of the great gods of Mesopotamia, linked with fresh water, deep subterranean waters, intelligence, craft, ritual knowledge, and cunning solutions to impossible problems. And that connection was not accidental. Eridu stood in the far south, near the marshes and the shifting waters where river and sea met. To later Mesopotamians, it was not just an old city. It was often treated as the first city, the place where organized human life began, the place where divine wisdom entered the human world. Think about how powerful that image is before the great cities, before imperial armies, before the first king in the famous king lists. There is water, there is Eridu, there is the god of the deep, and from that sacred zone come the sages. The traditions describe the first Apkallu as emerging from the sea or the deep waters. Later Greek writers, especially Berossus, preserved a version of this idea through the figure called Uanna, a fish-like teacher who came from the sea to instruct early humanity. Berossus wrote centuries after the earliest Sumerian tablets, so he is not a direct eyewitness to the oldest tradition. But his account preserves a remarkable memory. Ancient Mesopotamia imagined civilization arriving with a being linked to water, divine intelligence, and instruction. During the day, this being taught people how to build cities, establish laws, measure land, grow crops, and live in ordered communities. At night, he returned to the sea. That story sounds fantastic because it is fantastic. It is not a literal historical report. Nobody should treat it as evidence that an actual fishman walked onto a Sumerian beach and taught mathematics to the first farmers. But myths can still tell us what a culture believed mattered. For Mesopotamians, knowledge was not merely practical. It was sacred. The ability to measure a field, recite a ritual, interpret an omen, build a temple wall straight, or set the calendar correctly was part of maintaining cosmic order. These were skills, yes, but they were also inherited responsibilities. The sages represented that inheritance, and their presence did not disappear when the old stories were copied onto tablets. It continued in ritual life. Archaeologists have found small protective figurines placed beneath floors, inside walls, and at entrances of Mesopotamian buildings. Some show human-like figures wearing fish cloaks. Others show strange bird-headed or winged protective beings. In later Assyrian palaces, carved stone reliefs show similar figures standing beside kings, sacred trees, and doorways. They carry ritual objects. They make gestures of blessing and purification. They guard thresholds. Modern viewers sometimes see those images and immediately jump to aliens, forgotten civilizations, or secret visitors from another world. The actual Mesopotamian context is both less literal and more interesting. These were protective sacred figures. They belonged to a ritual system designed to keep chaos away from human spaces. Disease, bad luck, hostile spirits, impurity, and divine anger were not abstract fears. They were dangers people believed could cross a threshold, enter a house and tear apart the fragile order of life. So figurines were buried beneath the ground, guardians were placed at doors, ritual words were spoken, the wisdom associated with the Apkallu was made active, not just remembered. Imagine a house being built in ancient Mesopotamia. The walls are rising from mud brick, the rooms are still empty. Before the family moves in, ritual specialists place tiny figures in carefully chosen locations, hidden where no visitor will ever see them, under the floor, near the corners, at the entrances. The figures are sealed away, but their purpose is ongoing. They stand watch beneath the house, connecting that ordinary human dwelling to the protective wisdom of the primeval age. That is how alive the Apkallu tradition remained. The sages belonged to the time before the flood, but their authority reached forward into the present. Every later ritual expert who purified a room, recited a protective incantation, or consulted an omen could be understood as working in the shadow of that original divine teaching. And this is where An-Enlilda's place in the sequence becomes more than just a name and a list. He appears late in the line of primordial sages, at a point when the tradition is moving closer and closer to its great dividing event. Because after the flood, the relationship between gods, sages and human beings would not remain exactly the same. That is where the interpretive debates begin, because when scholars look at An-Enlilda, they are not looking at a complete biography carved into stone. They are looking at a name preserved in a tradition that passed through centuries of copying, translation, ritual use and revision. A name in a list can look simple, but ancient lists are never just lists. They are arguments about memory, about who belongs, about what came first, about who had the right to claim ancient authority. The first question is basic but difficult. Was An-Enlilda understood as a distinct individual sage with his own stories, teachings and identity? Or was the name functioning more like a title, an epithet, or a sacred label whose original meaning had become unclear even to later scribes? We do not have a surviving epic in which An-Enlilda walks into a city, gives a speech, performs a miracle, or teaches a specific craft. That absence matters. It means we should resist filling the silence with details that the tablets do not provide. But absence is not proof that no such stories ever existed. Mesopotamian literature survives in fragments. Clay tablets break. Libraries burn. Buildings collapse. A text may survive in one copy while 100 others vanish. The fact that we have the name at all suggests it carried enough importance to be preserved within the Seven Sage tradition. Yet it does not tell us exactly what every ancient reader thought when they encountered it. Some scholars see the names of the Apkallu as traces of a very old mythological tradition, perhaps reaching back into periods before writing was widespread. In this view, the names may preserve echoes of stories that were once told orally, then condensed into scholarly lists after the stories themselves were lost. Others are more cautious. They point out that the texts we possess are often much later than the imagined age of the sages. A First-Millennium Assyrian or Babylonian tablet can preserve material far older than itself. But it can also reshape that material. Scribes were not passive photocopiers. They compared manuscripts, standardized spellings, explained obscure words, and sometimes connected old traditions to the religious and political world they knew. Think of it like copying a family story for 1,000 years. Every generation insists it is preserving the original. And mostly it is, but names become unfamiliar. Places change. A sentence that once made perfect sense becomes mysterious. Eventually someone adds an explanation in the margin. The next copyist includes the margin in the story. A few hundred years later, nobody can tell where the original ended and the explanation began. That is the problem scholars face with An-Enlilda. There is also debate over whether the sequence of 7 should be treated as a fixed ancient canon from the beginning. The number 7 had enormous symbolic force in Mesopotamia. 7 gates, 7 judges, 7 divine powers, 7 dangerous spirits. 7 could signal completeness, cosmic order, a pattern that felt built into reality. So did Mesopotamian scholars inherit 7 actual names from a deep prehistory? Or did they organize older, scattered traditions into a sacred sequence of 7, because 7 was the number that made the system complete? The honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty. The evidence supports the existence of a well-established 7 Apkallu tradition in later Mesopotamian scholarship. It does not allow us to reconstruct, name by name, the moment each figure first entered the sequence. An-Enlilda may represent a very ancient inherited figure. He may reflect a name reshaped by generations of scribal interpretation. Or he may be evidence of both processes at once, an old memory surviving through a later intellectual framework, and that is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. These tablets show us that ancient people were already looking backward into a past they could not fully recover. They too were asking where wisdom came from. They too were preserving names whose deepest origins had become difficult to explain. If you enjoy mysteries like that, the book About 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available on the website, with a link in the description. Because sometimes the most fascinating mystery is not what we know. It is how much people fought to keep knowing it. An-Enlilda stands at exactly that boundary. Not a figure we can confidently turn into a historical person. Not evidence of a hidden technological civilization. Not proof that gods literally sent teachers from another world. Those claims go far beyond the tablets. But neither is he meaningless. His survival in the tradition tells us that Mesopotamian scholars regarded the chain of primordial wisdom as too important to break. Even when details were obscure, the names remained. The sequence remained. The memory of 7 teachers before the flood remained. And as the line moves toward its final sage, the tension becomes impossible to ignore. The sages belong to a world before the Great Rupture. A world where divine knowledge could still enter human civilization in its original form. But the flood is approaching. The old order is about to disappear beneath the water. One sage remains, and his position at the end of the list may be the most important of all. Number 7, Utuabzu, the 7th and final sage. The name appears at the end of the antediluvian chain. The last Apkallu before the flood divides the world into before and after. That position changes everything. Utuabzu is not simply another name added to a long list. He is the closing figure in a sacred sequence that Mesopotamian scholars treated as the foundation of civilization itself. Before kings ruled, before ordinary human history. Before the great waters erased the first world, there were 7 sages, and Utuabzu was the 7th. Then the flood came. In later scholarly texts, the 7 Apkallu are connected to the ancient cities of Sumer, especially the cities said to have existed before the deluge. Their purpose was not to conquer, build empires, or demand worship. They were teachers, bearers of divine knowledge, figures who stood between the gods and early humanity, bringing the skills required to make ordered life possible: writing, ritual, temple practice, law, agriculture. The measured knowledge that turned survival into civilization. But when we reach Utuabzu, the tradition becomes strangely quiet. We have his name, we have his place in the sequence. We know that later Mesopotamian scholars counted him among the 7 primordial sages, but we do not have a surviving epic centered on him. No long tablet tells us what he taught on a specific day. No surviving narrative gives us a speech in his own voice. No archaeological inscription identifies a building and says, "This was the work of Utuabzu." And that silence is exactly why he is so interesting. Ancient traditions often preserve their most important figures in the least satisfying way. A name survives because it was repeated in rituals, copied in lists, and memorized by scribes. But the stories behind the name vanish, not because they were unimportant, sometimes because they were so old that later generations inherited only the outline. Imagine finding the final page of a book that had been copied for 2,000 years. The ending is intact, the hero's name is still there, the last line is still there, but the chapters explaining how he reached that moment are gone. You know he mattered, because the story still insists on ending with him. But you do not know what was lost along the way. That may be the situation with Utuabzu. Even the name carries an atmosphere of deep antiquity. Utu is associated with the sun god in Sumerian tradition, while Abzu refers to the deep fresh waters beneath the earth, the primordial subterranean ocean connected with Enki, the god of wisdom. But ancient names are complicated. They can contain divine elements, old linguistic forms, titles, or meanings that changed over time. We should be careful not to treat a possible translation as a complete explanation of the figure. Still, the combination is striking. Sun and deep water, light and the hidden abyss, the visible heavens above and the sacred source below. Mesopotamian thought was built on those kinds of connections. The world was not divided neatly into science on one side and religion on the other. Knowledge itself had divine origins. The ability to measure fields, read omens, conduct rituals, record contracts, observe stars, and maintain a temple could all be understood as part of a cosmic order. The Apkallu represented that order in human form, and Utuabzu stands at the final edge of it. This is where modern speculation often rushes in. A final teacher before a world-ending flood sounds almost designed to trigger theories about survivors from lost civilizations, alien visitors, secret technologies, or forbidden knowledge buried beneath ancient ruins. But the surviving Mesopotamian evidence does not require any of that. The tablets do not describe Utuabzu arriving in a machine. They do not describe advanced weapons, vanished continents, or a scientifically documented civilization older than humanity. What they preserve is a mythological memory. Divine sages existed before the flood, and they taught humanity the arts of civilized life. That idea is powerful enough on its own. If you like following the line between ancient evidence and unanswered questions, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website with a link in the description. Because the real mystery is often not whether the ancient world hid impossible secrets. It is how fragments of belief could survive for millennia even after the stories that once explained them had disappeared. And Utuabzu is one of those fragments. His place as seventh may also be deliberate. 7 was not an accidental number in Mesopotamia. It marked completeness, a cycle brought to its proper end. 7 sages means not merely a group of teachers, but a finished pattern, a full transmission of divine wisdom before the coming catastrophe. Think about what that means. The flood does not interrupt the sequence after 3 sages, or 5, or 6. It comes after 7, after the number of completion. The old world receives its full measure of wisdom. The chain is complete. Only then does the rupture arrive. That does not prove the tradition preserves literal history from before a real global flood. It tells us something more direct about the people who recorded it. They believed civilization had a beginning beyond ordinary memory. They believed its first knowledge came from a sacred source. And they believed the flood marked a boundary so absolute that even wisdom had to be divided into what existed before it and what could survive after. Utuabzu stands on that boundary. the final teacher in the final generation of the First World. And to understand why later scribes kept repeating his name, we have to look more closely at what it meant for a sage to be the last one standing before the waters rose. But what happens to wisdom after that boundary? This is where the Mesopotamian tradition takes an unexpected turn. The flood does not end knowledge. It does not leave the surviving world empty, waiting for civilization to begin from nothing. Instead, it changes who carries that knowledge. Before the flood, the teachers are Apkallu, primordial sages connected to the divine world, figures whose authority comes from a time before ordinary human history. After the flood, later texts begin speaking of human sages. That distinction matters. The old teachers belong to the first age, the age when gods and humans stood closer together, when divine order could enter the world directly through beings like Utuabzu and the 6 sages before him. But the post-flood world is different. It is our kind of world. A world of cities, kings, temples, fields, debts, wars, births, deaths, and scribes pressing reeds into wet clay. The divine sages are gone. Human beings have to take their place, not replace them exactly. Nobody in Mesopotamia would have claimed that an ordinary scholar was equal to one of the ancient Apkallu. That would be like saying a student who studies astronomy is the same thing as the stars. But human scholars could inherit the tradition. They could preserve it, interpret it, and pass it forward. In Akkadian, one word used for a learned expert was Umannu. It can mean scholar, master craftsman, or learned sage, depending on the context. These were not just people who knew how to write. Writing itself was rare. It required years of training, access to temple or palace institutions, and the ability to read systems so difficult that even modern specialists spend entire careers mastering them. A Mesopotamian scribe might copy contracts in the morning, calculate grain deliveries in the afternoon, study omens at night, and preserve ancient hymns from tablets already hundreds of years old. He could be accountant, archivist, ritual expert, astronomer, legal technician, and historian all at once. That is the human successor to the Apkallu, and it reveals something important about the myth. The sages did not just teach humanity how to survive. They established the systems that allowed knowledge to outlive individuals. A field can be destroyed, a king can die, a city can fall. But a tablet, if copied again and again, can carry a voice across centuries. That was the real miracle. Think about the problem every civilization faces. One generation learns how to manage irrigation, predict floods, make beer, identify disease, negotiate disputes, build walls, or read the movement of the sky. Then that generation dies. If the knowledge dies with them, the next generation starts over. Civilization becomes a sandcastle built at low tide, rebuilt from scratch every time the water comes in. The Mesopotamians believed the Apkallu had given them a way out of that trap. They gave humanity tradition, not tradition in the soft modern sense, like a holiday meal or an old family custom. Tradition as a survival technology, a chain of memory, a system for making sure that what the ancestors learned could become the equipment of the living. After the flood, that chain becomes more fragile. It depends on humans now, on scribes who copy signs correctly, on teachers who train apprentices, on temples that protect archives, on rulers willing to support the people who understand calendars, rituals, accounting and law. And those human scholars knew exactly how fragile it was. Mesopotamia was a land where cities rose and fell with terrifying regularity. Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Ashur, Nineveh, each could become the centre of the world for a time. Each could be invaded, burned, abandoned, or reduced to ruins. Libraries were destroyed, temples were looted. Dynasties vanished so completely that later people sometimes knew them only from broken inscriptions buried in the earth. So when a scribe copied a list of ancient sages, he was doing more than repeating mythology. He was placing himself inside a chain that stretched back beyond the flood. The message was clear. We are not the first keepers of knowledge. We are the latest. That is why the shift from divine Apkallu to human Omanu is not a decline into a less magical age. In some ways, it is the beginning of responsibility. The gods may have given wisdom at the beginning, but after the old world ended, human beings had to do the exhausting work of keeping it alive. And that work was never guaranteed. A tablet could crack. A school could close. A language could change until ancient signs became almost unreadable. Even in Mesopotamia, where scribal culture endured for thousands of years, scholars were already struggling to understand texts copied from a much older past, which raises the next question. If the human sages inherited the wisdom of the Apkallu, how did they prove that inheritance, and why did later kings become so desperate to claim a connection to those teachers from before the flood? They proved it by surrounding themselves with the image of the ancient sages. Centuries after Utuabzu and the other Apkallu were said to have vanished into the world before the flood, their forms began appearing again. Not as living teachers, not as figures walking through palace doors and giving advice to kings. They returned as protectors. In the great Assyrian cities of the First-Millennium BCE, especially Nimrud and Nineveh, palace walls were covered with carved supernatural beings. Winged figures stood beside sacred trees. Some wore elaborate horned crowns. Some had human faces and wings. Others wore what looks almost like a fish costume, with the body of a fish draped over a human figure, the fish head rising above the wearer's own head like a hood. For a long time, people saw these carvings and called them genies. That word is convenient, but it can hide what the Mesopotamians were actually doing. These figures were not decorative fantasy creatures added to make a palace look impressive. They belonged to a serious system of protection. In ritual texts, beings identified as Apkallu appear as guardians against disease, curses, demons, and the invisible dangers that could enter a home, a temple, or a royal palace. And that changes the meaning of the image completely. Imagine walking into the palace of an Assyrian king. You pass enormous stone guardians at the gateway, creatures with the bodies of bulls or lions, wings of eagles and human heads. Then you enter the halls, and there they are on the walls. Ancient figures, calm and powerful, carrying ritual objects. One hand may hold a small bucket. The other raises a cone-shaped implement toward a tree, a king or a doorway. To us, it can look mysterious, almost alien. But to the people living there, the message was probably much more direct. This place is guarded. This king stands within sacred order. The wisdom that existed before the flood has not been lost. It is still here, watching the gates. The fish-cloaked figures are especially important because the earliest sage, Uanna, was closely associated with the sea and with Oannes in later Greek accounts. But later Mesopotamian traditions did not always preserve clean labels for every image. We should be careful here. Not every winged figure in Assyrian art can be identified with certainty as a specific Apkallu. Scholars still debate individual scenes, costumes, and ritual functions. But the broader pattern is clear. The Apkallu had become part of the protective architecture of Mesopotamian civilization. They were placed at thresholds because thresholds were dangerous. A doorway is not just a doorway in ancient ritual thinking. It is a break in the wall, a place where outside forces can enter. The same was true of city gates, palace entrances, windows, drains, foundations and corners of buildings. Anywhere order met the unknown, protection was needed. Archaeologists have found small clay figurines buried beneath floors and in the foundations of Assyrian buildings. Some were representations of Apkallu. Others were different protective beings. They were not meant to be seen by visitors. They were hidden deliberately, sealed under the structure itself. Think about that for a second. A palace could have guards with spears at the doors. It could have massive walls, it could have an army outside. But beneath the floor, unseen by almost everyone who walked above it, there could also be tiny clay sages from before the flood. The king was protecting his building on every level. Militarily, politically, religiously, magically. Because a palace was never just a house. It was the command centre of an empire. Grain records were stored there. Envoys arrived there. Armies received orders there. Taxes flowed there. Prophecies were interpreted there. If the palace fell into disorder, the kingdom could follow. So Assyrian rulers built defences not only against human enemies, but against the possibility that chaos itself could get inside. And who better to stop chaos than the beings believed to have brought order in the first place? This is where Utuabzu's story reaches beyond one name on a list. The seventh sage may be the final figure in the antediluvian sequence, but the sequence did not become irrelevant after the flood. It became more powerful with time. The older the Apkallu became, the more authority they carried. They were from before history, before the first surviving king lists. Before the oldest ruins anyone could see, before the flood that divided all time into two halves. That is an impossible kind of prestige. A later scholar could claim to preserve ancient knowledge. A king could claim to restore ancient temples. But the Apkallu represented something even deeper. They were the original source, the first guardians of civilization, the beings who had stood at the beginning when the rules of the world were still being established. And if you want to explore more mysteries where the evidence is real but the answers remain frustratingly incomplete, check out the book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. What makes the Apkallu so fascinating is that they sit exactly on the border between myth and history. We have the tablets, we have the ritual texts, we have the buried figurines, we have the palace reliefs. Those are real objects, made by real people who believed these ancient sages still mattered. What we cannot prove is whether the stories preserve a distant memory, symbolic ideas about civilization, religious tradition, or some mixture of all three. Maybe that uncertainty is the point. The Mesopotamians did not need the Apkallu to be historical in the modern sense. They needed them to be foundational. They needed to believe that wisdom had an origin, that order was older than any king, and that even after flood, war, plague, and collapse, knowledge could survive. Utuabzu was the last sage before the Great Dividing Line. But in the generations that followed, his presence, and the presence of all 7 Apkallu, remained buried under floors, carved into stone, preserved in tablets and carried forward by the people determined not to let the first wisdom disappear. And that may be the real legacy of the 7 Apkallu. Not that 7 strange beings literally climbed out of the Persian Gulf, wearing fish skins, and handed humanity the secrets of writing, law, agriculture, temple building, medicine, and kingship. Maybe they did, according to the myth, but history asks a different question. Why did one of the world's first civilizations preserve this story for so long? Why did scribes copy these names? Why did priests invoke them in rituals? Why did Assyrian kings bury their images beneath palaces, thousands of years after the cities before the flood were supposed to have vanished? Because for the Mesopotamians, civilization was never something humans had simply invented on their own. It was fragile. It had to be taught, protected, repaired whenever the world slipped back toward chaos. And the Apkallu were the proof that order had a beginning. Uanna, the first sage, was remembered as the one who emerged from the waters and brought the foundations of civilized life. In later Greek accounts, he became Oannes, the fish-like teacher who taught people how to build cities, make laws, cultivate fields, and understand the world around them. That image is unforgettable. A being rising from the sea at dawn, speaking to people who had no cities, no writing, no organized knowledge, and giving them the tools to become human in a new way. Then came Uannedugga, Enmedugga, Enmegalamma, Enmebulugga, An-Enlilda, and finally Utuabzu. Their names can sound almost impossible to hold on to at first. Ancient syllables preserved across millennia, copied by scribes, who may not have spoken the same language as the people who first told their stories. But together, those names formed a sequence. 7 sages. 7 teachers, 7 beings assigned to the 7 antediluvian kings who ruled before the flood. And that number was not random. 7 was already a powerful number in Mesopotamian thought. 7 divine powers, 7 gates, 7 dangerous forces. 7 major celestial bodies visible to the naked eye. The number carried a sense of completion, cosmic structure, a pattern built into reality itself. So when Mesopotamian tradition placed 7 Apkallu before the flood, it was saying something larger than there were simply 7 individual teachers. It was saying that the world before the flood had been complete. It had received the full measure of divine wisdom. Then that world ended. That is the part that makes this tradition so haunting. The Apkallu are not just wise beings. They are survivors from the other side of a boundary no human can cross. They belong to the age before catastrophe, before the waters erased the first cities, before kingship had to begin again, before memory itself became uncertain. The Sumerian king list gives us kings with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Later texts give us sages connected to those impossible reigns. Modern readers can look at those numbers and dismiss the whole thing as fantasy. And yes, in the literal sense, these are mythological traditions. Nobody ruled for 28,800 years. Nobody can demonstrate that a fish-cloaked immortal taught the first humans how to write. But dismissing the story entirely would miss what it tells us. These were not casual tales. They were part of a vast intellectual system, a system that linked kingship to the gods, wisdom to the deep waters of the Abzu, and civilization to knowledge passed down from an earlier age. The people of ancient Mesopotamia were asking questions we still ask now. Where did knowledge come from? Who taught the first teachers? Why do humans have civilization at all, when the natural world can be so violent, unpredictable, and cruel? And what happens when everything built by one generation is destroyed before the next can inherit it? The flood answered that last question in the most terrifying way possible. Everything can disappear. Cities can vanish. Temples can collapse. Records can be washed away. Families can be scattered. Languages can die. The names of kings can become dust. But knowledge, if someone preserves it, can outlive the disaster. That is why the Apkallu mattered. They represented knowledge that survived the flood, knowledge that could not be drowned. In some traditions, the sages did not die like ordinary humans. They returned to the waters. In others, their authority lived on through ritual, through priestly learning, through the sacred texts that later scholars claimed to preserve. And maybe that is why the fish imagery is so powerful. Fish belong to the water, but they can emerge from it. They move through the place that destroyed the old world and come back carrying what was lost. It is a perfect symbol for memory. The strange part is that this tradition was never hidden in the way modern titles sometimes suggest. These were not banned tablets locked away because someone was afraid of what they revealed. The tablets were difficult, sacred, specialized, and often accessible only to trained scribes and priests. That is not the same thing as forbidden. They survived because generations of people thought they were worth copying. And today the evidence is scattered across museums. Excavation reports, broken clay tablets, ritual texts, king lists, bilingual lexical lists, palace carvings, and small figurines found under ancient floors. No single tablet gives us the entire story in one clean, perfect form. That is not how ancient history works. It comes to us in fragments. A name here, a damaged line there, a ritual instruction written centuries after the supposed event. A Greek writer describing a Babylonian tradition through his own language and assumptions. A carved figure in an Assyrian palace, a tiny clay guardian sealed beneath a foundation and left untouched for more than 2,000 years. Then, slowly, the fragments begin to connect. Not into certainty, into a pattern. That pattern tells us that the Apkallu were among the most enduring figures in Mesopotamian religious imagination. They began as primordial sages associated with the gods and the age before the flood. Over time, they became ritual protectors, symbols of scholarship, guardians of buildings, and living reminders that civilization had sacred roots. And perhaps that is why their story still gets under our skin. We live in a world surrounded by knowledge so common that we barely notice it. We can read, we can write, we grow food using techniques refined over thousands of years. We build cities with systems so complicated that almost nobody understands all of them. We preserve information in libraries, servers, archives, and satellites orbiting above the planet. But remove enough of those systems and how much would we really know? How many people could make metal from raw ore? How many could build a boat without modern tools? How many could preserve food through winter, create medicine from plants, make a written record, navigate by stars, or rebuild a city from nothing? The ancient Mesopotamians understood something we often forget. Civilization is not automatic. It is inherited. Every generation receives a world built by people who came before. Every generation is responsible for passing something on. And when people tell stories about beings who brought knowledge from before the flood, they may be expressing a truth deeper than literal history. Wisdom always seems to come from before us, from ancestors, from teachers, from forgotten hands that wrote on clay long before our own names existed. So were the Apkallu gods, demons, priests transformed into myth, symbolic embodiments of divine knowledge, memories of ancient culture heroes, or something stranger that we no longer have the language to describe. The honest answer is that we do not know. The tablets do not give us a final answer. They give us names, roles, rituals, and a world view. They show us what ancient Mesopotamians believed was important enough to preserve. Beyond that, speculation has to remain speculation. But the mystery is not weakened by that uncertainty. It becomes stronger, because somewhere in the mud-brick cities of Sumer, among the first people to write down their thoughts on clay, there was an idea that knowledge had arrived from a world older than memory. A world divided from ours by a great flood. A world whose 7 teachers had shaped everything that came after. And even after their cities fell, even after Sumerian became a language of scholars rather than daily speech, even after empires rose and vanished across the same plains, the Apkallu remained. Their names survived: Uanna, Uannedugga, Enmedugga, Enmegalamma, Enmebulugga, An-Enlilda, Utuabzu. 7 names from before the flood, still echoing through the ruins of the first cities. If this journey through the Apkallu changed the way you see ancient Mesopotamia, leave a like. It helps more people find these stories, and subscribe if you want to keep exploring the mysteries buried in the oldest records of human civilization. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? It is always incredible to see how far these ancient stories travel from the ruins of Eridu and Nineveh to listeners all over the world. If you listen on Spotify, that is honestly one of the best ways to support the channel. The Spotify link is in the description, because the next time you hear that civilization began with kings, cities and writing, remember the older story the Mesopotamians told. Before the first kings, before the flood, before history itself, there were 7 teachers, and humanity never stopped trying to remember what they knew.